Good evening, time travelers. Imagine yourself standing in a world where darkness is not a temporary inconvenience, but an absolute governing law. Before the electric switch granted us the power to banish shadows at will, and long before the orange glow of street lamps turned the night into a pale imitation of the day, how did humanity find peace when the sun retreated? For thousands of years, the arrival of night was not simply the absence of photons. It was a physical threshold into vulnerability, a transformation where the familiar contours of your home became alien landscapes, and where the body never truly lowered its guard. Picture yourself lying in an obscurity so profound that if you held your hand inches from your face, it would dissolve into the void. You are listening to the creaking of timber and the wind, sounds you cannot verify with sight. You feel a damp chill that defies the heaviest wool blankets. You are waiting for a dawn that is guided only by the slow rotation of the stars, arriving in perhaps 1 hour or perhaps 5, with no clock to tell you which. Tonight, we are stepping into those long, uncertain hours. We are not here to observe from a distance, but to inhabit the quiet struggle that defined the sleep of our ancestors. Before we cross into this realm of fragile rest and heavy shadows, I have a small request. If you wish to continue these gentle journeys into history's forgotten corners, please tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History. It helps these narratives find other weary souls seeking quiet company in the late hours. Perhaps you are watching this in the deep stillness of 3 a.m., or perhaps the sun is just breaking the horizon where you are. Leave a comment below. Tell me your time zone, your hour, and the shape of the night around you right now. Now, if you can, dim the sharp lights of your room. Turn on a fan to create that soft white noise hum that smooths the jagged edges of silence. Let us settle in and drift back to an era when night pressed against the walls, when sleep was a fragmented shifting of consciousness, and when rest was a mercy, not a guarantee. The end of the day begins long before the true dark arrives. You have been tracking the quality of the light for hours, measuring the waning sun against a list of tasks that is never truly finished. You calculate the remaining minutes. Is there time to mend the tear in the grain sack? To haul one last bucket of water from the well? To ensure the livestock are secure before the world turns gray? The sun, however, is an indifferent master. It follows its own celestial arc, unconcerned with your fatigue or your ambition. By the time the horizon begins to bleed into purple and gray, your body is already bearing the accumulated weight of the daylight hours. Your shoulders throb with a dull, rhythmic ache, the result of labor that rarely varies. Lifting, bending, threshing, hauling, these are movements repeated so often they have bypassed thought and etched themselves into your muscle memory. Your hands are rough maps of your life, calloused pads, skin stained by soil, marked by splinters or small cuts that stopped stinging hours ago. This exhaustion is not dramatic. It does not arrive like a thunderclap, but rather like a slow thickening of the blood, a heaviness that settles deep in your legs and the small of your back. It is a persistent companion, a baseline of pain you have learned to carry simply as the cost of being alive. You know, as your ancestors knew, that the sleep awaiting you tonight will not magically erase this weariness. Rest in this time does not restore you to a pristine state like the recharge of a battery. Instead, it offers just enough recovery to allow you to stand up and do it all again tomorrow, carrying forward a silent deficit of energy that piles up over weeks, seasons, and years. In the height of summer, the day stretches so long that the sun becomes a tyrant. You are forced to work because the light remains, even as your body screams for stillness. In the depths of winter, the opposite cruelty applies. Darkness falls while urgent work remains, forcing a choice: fumble through tasks with clumsy, frozen hands, or leave them undone, knowing they will be waiting for you in the freezing gray of morning. But tonight it is autumn, and the balance feels merciful. The air has cooled enough that the sweat on your brow dries quickly, yet it is not so frigid that your knuckles lock up. The light is fading at a reasonable hour, not too early, not impossibly late. Yet as the sky dims, you feel that ancient instinctive tightening in your chest. Night is the great leveler, and with it comes the exposure that daylight keeps at bay. The hour of gloaming, twilight, is a strange liminal space. It is neither day nor night, but a blurred boundary where visibility is deceptive. You can see well enough to walk, but not well enough to work with any craft. Notice how the village quiets down. Voices across the lane or within your own cottage drop to a hush. This isn't a rule written in any book. It is an instinct. Loud sounds feel abrasive now, dangerous even, as if shouting might attract the attention of things that wake when the sun sleeps. You move through your final chores with efficient resignation. The chickens must be barricaded against the foxes, the weasels, and the two-legged thieves who thrive in the dark. The heavy wooden door must be checked, the iron latch tested, the gaps inspected. The iron tools, the hoe, the axe, the spade, must be brought inside. Not only are they valuable targets for theft, but the morning dew will corrode their edges, and should you need a weapon in the confusion of the night, you cannot be fumbling for it in the yard. There is a single window in your dwelling, simply an open square in the wall, covered by a wooden shutter, swinging on stiff leather hinges. You close it now, pressing it firmly against the frame until it wedges shut. The draft vanishes. The room instantly feels smaller, more contained, perhaps safer, but also suffocatingly distinct from the world outside. The fire in the central hearth has been the heartbeat of the house since dawn. Now you face the nightly tactical decision of how to manage it. To let it die completely is to invite a miserable morning. Waking to a freezing room and the tedious, knuckle-scraping labor of striking flint and steel against damp tinder is a punishment you wish to avoid. But to keep it roaring is wasteful and dangerous. Instead, you choose to curfew the fire, a term derived from the French couvre-feu, to cover the fire. You carefully bank the glowing embers, burying them under a mound of gray ash to starve them of oxygen just enough to slow their burn, hoping a single live coal remains to birth the morning's flame. Fire is a fickle houseguest. It might smother and die despite your care, or it might spit a spark into the dry rushes of the floor, turning your home into a torch. You bank it anyway. The fear of the morning frost outweighs the fear of the night fire. The room plunges into near total obscurity, illuminated only by the faint, pulsating red glow bleeding through the ash pile. You possess a single candle made of tallow, rendered beef or sheep fat. It is not the clean-burning beeswax of the church or the nobility. It smells of cooking grease and emits a thick, oily smoke. You will not light it unless there is an emergency. Candles cost money or labor. Darkness is free. Your eyes strain to adjust. The familiar objects of your life, the rough-hewn table, the storage chest, the low bench, are reduced to silhouettes, suggestions of shape rather than certainties. You consider washing. There is a bucket of water near the door, but it was drawn hours ago and is now bitingly cold. In the heat of July, splashing it on your face is a relief. Tonight, the thought of cold water on tired skin feels like too much to bear. Instead, you run your hands through your hair, shaking out the dust and chaff of the fields. You brush vaguely at your tunic, though the effort is futile. The scent of your life clings to everything: wood smoke, unwashed wool, earth, livestock, and old sweat. It is a sensory cocktail so ubiquitous you stopped smelling it years ago. Your clothing is a system of layers designed for survival. You wear a linen undertunic to absorb sweat, a heavier wool outer tunic for warmth, hose tied at the waist, a belt, and a coif or cap that has covered your head since you rose. You unbuckle the belt, allowing your stomach to expand and the pressure to leave your hips. The tunics stay on, the hose stay on, the cap stays on. In the deep freeze of January, you would sleep fully clothed, perhaps even wearing your cloak. Tonight, in the mild autumn, you compromise by keeping your base layers. To be naked is to be vulnerable to the biting drafts that snake through the wattle and daub walls, and to be unclothed is to be unprepared should you need to flee or fight in the dark. Your feet throb with a specific, dull heat that comes from 12 hours of standing on packed earth. You pry off your shoes, simple leather turn shoes worn thin at the heel, and the relief is immediate as your toes spread. The dirt floor is cool against your soles, a fleeting pleasure before the chill sets in. You move toward the sleeping platform. It is not high, raised perhaps 2 feet on sturdy wooden posts, just enough to keep you above the layer of coldest air that hugs the floor, and to offer a small fortress against the rats and drafts. The platform itself is rough timber, with gaps between the planks wide enough for dust and straw to fall through. Resting on these boards is your mattress, a large sackcloth bag stuffed tight with straw. It is not soft. It crunches when you press it. Over months of sleep, the straw has broken down and shifted, creating hard ridges and hollow valleys. You must knead it with your fist, trying to redistribute the filling, breaking up the knots of compressed stalks to create a surface that is merely uncomfortable rather than painful. You run your hand over the surface, probing for the inevitable. Hard lumps that have migrated into painful clusters, damp patches that might signal rot or mildew, or the subtle shifting that suggests a mouse or beetle has made its nest inside your bedding. Tonight, it passes inspection. You have 2 blankets. They are woven wool, heavy enough to hold heat, but coarse enough to abrade any skin they touch. You lay one beneath you to blunt the harsh texture of the straw, and the other you will pull over you, though experience tells you it will slip, bunch, and leave your feet exposed before the night is through. You lower yourself onto the mattress. The straw crackles loudly, a dry, bursting sound that always seems too violent for the quiet room. The platform is narrow, wide enough for you and perhaps one other, but certainly not spacious. If you had a spouse, or if children were still young, this would be a puzzle of limbs, a nightly negotiation of space where bodies are arranged like spoons. But tonight you are alone. It is a luxury, but also a specific kind of loneliness. You settle onto your side, the position that offers the best compromise of pain. Your hip
digs into the straw, and even through the underblanket, you can feel the rigid spine of the wooden boards beneath. Your shoulder takes the brunt of your weight, a pressure that will turn into a dull ache within the hour, forcing you to move. You pull the top blanket up to your chin, tucking the edges beneath your shoulders and legs, sealing yourself into a cocoon to hoard your own body heat. The wool smells of lanolin, wood smoke, and the damp mustiness of fabric that never truly dries. For a few moments, there is relief. It is the simple, profound relief of being horizontal after 12 hours of being vertical. The relief of stillness, the relief of being enclosed with the door barred and the shutter fast. But sleep does not come. It rarely does, not immediately. Now that the distractions of labor are gone, your body begins to catalog its complaints. The ache in your lower back, ignored while you hauled water, now sharpens into a focal point. Your left knee throbs with a rhythmic pulse, perhaps an old injury flaring up, or perhaps the early warning of arthritis that will plague your old age. Your jaw aches. You realize you have been clenching your teeth against the cold and the stress of the day. The darkness is nearly absolute. With the shutter sealed and the embers buried in ash, there is no ambient light to carve out the room. You cannot see the walls. You cannot see the ceiling. This is a disorienting, suffocating blackness. Intellectually, you know the dimensions of your room, but your eyes, desperate for input, strain to find a focal point. Failing that, your brain begins to hallucinate, supplying phantom shapes, swirling grays, shadows moving within shadows, things that are not there. You squeeze your eyes shut, but it changes nothing. The darkness inside your head is identical to the darkness in the room. Sound becomes your only reality. From the hearth, a log settles in the ash, a soft hiss clump that makes your heart hammer in your chest before you identify it. Outside, something moves. A fox? A badger? A thief? You cannot know. It is just a rustle, then silence. The wind presses against the daub walls, a low, melancholy sigh that carries tension in its breath. The wooden shutter creaks once, twice, straining against its latch. You strain your ears for human sounds, voices, the scuff of a boot, the rattle of a weapon. You hear nothing. This silence is a double-edged sword. It could mean safety, or it could mean that whatever is out there is moving with predatory quiet. Your thoughts begin to loop, entering that anxious purgatory between wakefulness and sleep. You replay the conversation you had at the market. Did you speak too freely? Did you offend the miller? You tally your debts, the grain you owe, the winter ahead. Small worries that would wither in the sunlight grow monstrous in the dark. You try to empty your mind, to be like a still pond, but your brain refuses. It wants to solve, to plan, to worry, to revise the past, and fear the future. Time becomes fluid and strange. You have absolutely no way to measure it. Have you been lying here for 10 minutes or 2 hours? Unless you rise, unbar the door, and check the position of the stars, you cannot know. And to do so would mean surrendering the precious warmth you have built up under the wool. Your hip begins to burn where it presses into the mattress. The pain isn't sharp, but it is relentless. A rising volume signal demanding you move. You shift, rolling onto your stomach. This relieves the hip but twists your neck, straining the vertebrae. Your arms are suddenly homeless. Tucked under you, they go numb. Stretched out, the shoulders ache. At your sides, they feel exposed. You roll again, onto your back. This flattens the lumbar curve, causing your lower back to protest, but it buys you a few minutes of relief for your shoulders. Staring up into the void, unable to distinguish the ceiling from the infinite sky, you finally feel the fraying edges of consciousness. Your thoughts lose their sharp edges. Your breathing slows. Your body lowers its guard. You drift not into a deep coma, but into a shallow gray state, no longer fully here, but not yet gone. Then you wake, abruptly. You don't know why. There was no scream, no crash, but something has yanked you back from the threshold. Your heart is beating fast. You lie frozen, listening so hard your ears ring. Nothing. Just the wind. Just the settling embers. Just the indifferent night sounds of the wild.
Maybe your body's survival instinct simply refused to let you go too deep. Maybe this is just the rhythm of the night, the first sleep ending before the second sleep begins. You close your eyes again. You force your breathing into a slow, heavy rhythm, trying to trick your physiology into believing it is asleep. It works, unreliably. Your mind wanders again, but now it is less logical, more dreamlike. You think of your childhood bed. You remember stories of the Mara, the night demons that sit on chests and steal breath. In the daylight, you're a rational person. In the pitch black of 2 a.m., the line between superstition and reality dissolves. You drift again. Sleep comes in jagged fragments, a mosaic of unconsciousness. You are under, then you are surfacing, then under again. The transitions are blurred. When you wake a second time, your body has moved on its own. You are facing the wall, the blanket tangled around your shins. Your arm is pinned beneath your ribs, dead numb, and as you move, it screams with the pins and needles of returning blood. You wrestle the blanket back up. The room has grown colder. The embers are dying. You can feel the moisture of your own breath condensing on your face, though you cannot see the vapor. And then the eternal question returns. What time is it? This is the torment of the pre-industrial night. How long until dawn? Have you slept the night away, or is it only midnight? Is the sun about to crest, or do you have 6 more hours of shivering darkness to endure? There is no clock to check, no glowing screen. Even if you opened the shutter, clouds might mask the moon. You are adrift in time, relying on a guess that feels increasingly desperate. This uncertainty is a specific kind of exhaustion. If you knew it was 5 a.m., you could grit your teeth and wait. If you knew it was 11 p.m., you could resign yourself to try sleeping again. But not knowing means you exist in a limbo of waiting, hoping, and calculating in the dark. You try to sleep again, but your mind has become a restless prisoner. It beats against the walls of your skull, demanding answers. What time is it? What was that noise? It wants to solve problems that have no solution in the dark, lying on a sack of straw. The cold is becoming an active antagonist. Your face, the only part of you exposed to the air, is stinging. Your nose is numb. You pull the rough wool higher, burying your head until only a small tunnel remains for breathing. This helps trap the heat, but it triggers a primal claustrophobia. You are warm, but you are trapped. You drift again. This time, sleep holds you a little tighter. Minutes pass? Hours? There is no metric. Your dreams, when they arrive, are not grand visions or nightmares. They are dull, repetitive echoes of your waking life. Mending a fence, arguing with a neighbor, carrying water. Your brain is simply rehearsing the drudgery of survival. You wake again. This time, your body feels like wood.
Your neck is a stiff rod. Your back is a knot of tension. Your legs feel filled with lead. To move requires a deliberate act of will, fighting the inertia that has settled into your bones. The straw beneath you has compressed further, losing whatever meager loft it had, and now your hip and ribs are grinding directly against the hard planks of the bed frame. You shift, turning, twisting, seeking a comfort that does not exist, not in this bed, not in this house, perhaps not in this century. Sleep on a straw mattress is a ceaseless negotiation between exhaustion and pain, a compromise where nobody wins.
Outside, the acoustic landscape shifts. A sound that was constant, the wind, has died. Its absence reveals a new layer of silence, populated by smaller, sharper noises. Drip, drip, condensation falling from the thatch. Scrape, a branch dragging against the daub wall. Or is it a footstep? You freeze, your breath held in your lungs, listening for the rhythm of intent. You listen until your focus fractures, until the noises blur into a static hum that your brain stops trying to decode. Gradually, you surrender your vigilance. You soften back into the mattress. Sleep returns, but it is fickle now. It comes in waves, advancing and retreating like a tide. You exist in a liminal gray zone, floating between consciousness and oblivion, never fully landing in either. Time continues its unmeasured march. Your body rotates through a cycle of positions, chasing relief from pressure points that migrate but never vanish. The blanket tangles. You kick it free. It tangles again. The cold deepens. You know from the ache in your joints that you are approaching the wolf hour, that deepest, coldest trough of the night just before dawn begins to break. You wonder, not for the first time, if you are broken. Do other people sleep soundly? Are there houses in the village where breath comes easy and rest is unbroken? You suspect that everyone lies awake like this, staring into the dark, wrestling with their own minds. But nobody talks about it. You rise, you work, you survive. The quality of your night is a private battle, unshared. Your thoughts begin to liquefy. You are aware of being cold, of being sore, of desperate longing for the sun. But these feelings seem to belong to a stranger. You drift down, deeper this time. Your breathing evens out. Your muscles unlock. This is the sleep your body has been begging for, the true restorative shutdown. But even here in the deep dark, a sentry remains on duty. A part of your brain is still listening. If a twig snaps too loudly, if the temperature drops too sharply, if the smell of smoke changes, you will snap awake instantly. You are never fully unguarded. The pre-industrial night does not allow for total surrender. Time passes in this deep state. Then you surface, not to full wakefulness, but to a groggy, heavy awareness. You feel different, heavier. The cold has seeped through the wool and into your marrow. You are shivering. You curl your knees to your chest, making yourself small, trying to become your own furnace. It helps the cold, but it drives the head of your femur into the mattress, rekindling the ache in your hip. And then the inevitable biological demand. Your bladder is full. It has been filling slowly for hours, a pressure that is now impossible to ignore. This is the nightly dilemma. To relieve yourself means leaving the cocoon of warmth, exposing your skin to the biting air, and navigating blind to the chamber pot in the corner, or worse, out the door to the midden. You try to bargain with your body. Just wait until dawn.
But the pressure builds, and you know from 1,000 nights before that discomfort always wins. Reluctantly, you throw back the blanket. The cold hits you like a physical blow. You slide your legs over the edge of the platform, your bare feet searching for the floor. The packed earth is freezing, so cold it burns your soles. You stand, shivering violently, arms stretched out like a sleepwalker, feeling for obstacles in a darkness that hasn't lifted an inch. Your hand finds the rough wall, trailing along the plaster until you find the pot. The act is clumsy, hurried, done in blind haste. You're stiff, shaking, and miserable. You navigate back, terrified of stubbing a toe or knocking over a stool in the pitch black. When you finally scramble back onto the mattress and pull the covers up, the damage is done. You are wide awake. The precious warmth you hoarded for hours is gone. You are starting from zero, lying there shaking, waiting for your own blood to heat the air trapped under the wool. Surely morning is close. Surely you have been enduring this for 8, 9 hours. Surely the sun is about to strike the shower. But you have played this game before. You have hoped for dawn only to lie there for 3 more hours. The night is elastic. It stretches minutes into hours, hours into eternities. You squeeze your eyes shut. You try to chase the tail of that deep sleep you lost. But your body is too alert now, stung by the cold and the movement. You think about the day to come. The cows need milking. The field needs turning. The same tasks, the same ache. You are already tired, and the day hasn't even broken. You are starting with a debt. This is simply the reality of existence. The night is not a time of restoration. It is a suspension of labor, a battleground where you fight for rest against cold, fleas, and your own mind. Finally, exhaustion overpowers alertness. You drift. Your thoughts become nonsense soup, memories blending with hallucinations. Time passes. The night rolls on. Somewhere, far beyond your perception, the sun begins to shift its angle. Dawn is beginning its slow, silent approach. But you cannot know that yet. You can only wait, suspended in the void, hoping that the wheel of the world is still turning, hoping that light will return to bring the familiar hardship of the day. This is the rhythm of your life, the quiet struggle of the dark hours, the body seeking rest it cannot find, the mind counting hours it cannot measure. Imagine yourself there, in that darkness, waiting. Imagine the relentless nature of this cold, this profound discomfort, this jagged, interrupted rhythm of rest. Now, realize that this was not a temporary camping trip or a power outage to be waited out. This was the texture of existence. Every single night for 70 years, with no alternative, no climate control, and no artificial dawn to chase away the shadows. For the vast majority of our ancestors, night was not a sanctuary of restoration, it was an endurance test. Let us shift our focus from the general to the specific. Let us follow the thread of one ordinary life, unrecorded by history books, but defined by the accumulated weight of thousands of such nights. Her name was Margaret. In the few parish records where her existence is noted, she is referred to only as Widow Finch, defined by the man she lost rather than the life she led. She was born in 1653 in the damp, rolling hills of Somerset, England, the fourth daughter of tenant farmers who worked soil they would never own. Her nights began in a crowded symphony of breath and movement. As a child, privacy was a concept she would not have understood. She slept on a wide platform, packed tight with siblings, a tangle of limbs and wool. This proximity offered a grim trade-off. The body heat of her sisters kept the freezing draft at bay, but it guaranteed a night of constant disturbance. Someone was always coughing, someone was always kicking, someone was always crying out from a dream. In those early years, however, exhaustion was a simple equation. A child's body, worn down by play and chores, demands sleep with a ferocity that overrides discomfort. Margaret would collapse onto the straw and sink into the dead sleep of youth. But even then, the night was never truly still. Babies wailed in the darkness. Her father would bolt upright, seizing a tool or a weapon at the sound of a latch lifting. Her mother seemed to exist in a state of permanent semi-consciousness, one eye always open, one ear always tuned to the frequency of danger. Margaret learned early that for a woman, deep sleep was a liability. Rest was not a right, it was a loan, taken in small, stolen increments, always ready to be paid back at the first sign of trouble. At 17, Margaret's sleeping arrangements changed. She married Thomas Finch, a carpenter 10 years her senior. It was a practical match, not a romance. He was steady, strong, and acceptable to her father. She moved from the chaotic hive of her childhood home to a slightly quieter but no less intimate reality. A single room shared with a stranger. The first months of marriage introduced her to a new catalog of nocturnal interruptions. Thomas was a large man, and he snored with a deep, rattling resonance that seemed to shake the timber frame of the house. He was a restless sleeper, his limbs twitching with the phantom motions of sawing and hammering, often stripping the blankets from her and leaving her shivering in the dark. She learned the complex dance of the marital bed, the expectation of intimacy even when her bones ached with fatigue, and the necessity of being available. Yet there was solace here too. Thomas radiated heat like a brick oven. Pressed against his back on a January night, she found a depth of warmth she had never known in the crowded bed of her sisters. His heavy presence was a barrier against the dark, a physical manifestation of safety. But 4 months later, the nights turned against her. Pregnancy transformed the act of lying down into a puzzle of discomfort. As the child grew, it pressed against her bladder and sat heavy on her sciatic nerve. There was no posture that offered relief. Lying on her stomach was impossible. Lying on her back crushed her lungs. Lying on her side pulled at her ligaments. And the need to urinate became a nightly torture. 3, 4, 5 times a night, she would have to heave herself up, navigate the freezing darkness to the chamber pot, and then try to settle back into the rustling straw without waking Thomas. She rarely succeeded. Thomas, though a decent man, found his patience eroded by the broken sleep. He would groan, turn his back, and mutter about the draft she let in. The guilt of waking him added a psychological weight to her physical discomfort. She tried to move like a ghost, but straw mattresses do not allow for silence. The birth happened in the dead of winter, under the cover of night, as so many things did. The labor began at dusk and stretched through the dark hours. The midwife took command, banishing Thomas to a neighbor's hearth. Margaret remembered that night only as a blur of agony, lantern light, and the hushed, urgent voices of women. The child was a girl. She lived for 4 days. Margaret never knew why. There was no fever, no cough. One night the baby was warm and nursing. The next, Margaret woke to a silence that was too absolute. The small bundle between her and Thomas had turned cool. The chrisom child, a baby who died within a month of baptism, was buried in the churchyard in a patch of earth so small it barely disturbed the grass. The nights that followed were a descent into a new kind of hell. This was the insomnia of grief. Margaret would jolt awake, her arms reaching out to cradle a weight that wasn't there. She would hear the phantom cry of an infant, a sound so real her milk would let down, soaking her shift and adding a physical sting to the emotional void. Thomas grieved like a stone, silent, immobile, distant. The warmth of his back no longer offered comfort. It felt like a wall. Margaret lay awake for hours, staring into the thatch, waiting for a dawn that offered no relief, only the exhausting demand to rise and work again. Recovery was slow, a gradual dulling of the sharpest edges of pain. Eventually, she learned to sleep again, or at least to achieve a state of unconsciousness sufficient to keep her alive.
Then another pregnancy, another daughter. This one was a fighter, loud, hungry, and demanding. Margaret's nights were now dictated entirely by the biological clock of the infant. The baby woke to feed every few hours, regardless of the moon or the mother's exhaustion. Margaret would haul herself up, pull the child to her breast, and sit in the cold, shivering while the baby nursed. Thomas would wake briefly, grunt, and roll over, retreating into the oblivious sleep of the father, leaving Margaret to the solitary vigil of the mother. Time began to liquefy. Margaret lost the ability to distinguish Tuesday from Friday. She existed in a permanent twilight, a fog of fatigue where she was never fully asleep and never fully awake. A second surviving child followed, then a third. The sleeping platform became a battlefield of needs. The children woke in relays, one with a bad dream, one with a wet clout, one with a fever. Margaret developed a third eye, a heightened state of arousal where she could sleep through the wind howling outside, but wake instantly at the distinct catch in her youngest child's breath. Thomas complained less as the years went on, but he also participated less. He learned to sleep through the chaos, burrowing deep into the straw, leaving Margaret to manage the nocturnal economy of the household alone. She did not resent him, not exactly. In her world, this was the natural order. Men worked the fields, women worked the nights. Margaret was 35 when her youngest child finally began to sleep through the night. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, she was not summoned by a cry. She thought, perhaps, that rest would finally return to her. She was wrong. Her body had been conditioned by 20 years of interruption. Her brain was wired to wake every 3 hours, and so it did. She would open her eyes in the silence, heart pounding, listening for a cry that didn't come. And now, age had begun to levy its own tax. Her lower back, punished by years of lifting children in buckets, throbbed with a dull, toothache-like persistence. Her hands, swollen from years of scrubbing in cold water and spinning wool, stiffened into claws during the night. The silence she had craved for so long was now filled with the creaking of her own joints and the anxious racing of her mind. Thomas, always the sturdy oak of her life, began to rot from the inside. His decline started with the coughing fits, deep, liquid rattling sounds that shook him awake in the blue hours of the morning. He would stumble to the door, open it to the freezing air, spit phlegm into the yard, and return to bed, bringing the chill of the grave with him. The coughing would subside for an hour, then return with mechanical cruelty. This cycle repeated every autumn and winter, each season stripping another layer of vitality from him. Margaret was 42 when the coughing finally won. It had mutated into a lung fever, likely pneumonia or consumption. He died at night, as was the custom of their world. She was lying beside him, sinking her own breath to his labored rasps, when suddenly the rhythm broke. The silence that followed was heavy. For a long time she lay still, hoping he had simply fallen into a deep, healing sleep. But when she finally reached out, his skin was already cooling, the heat draining away like water into sand. Widowhood brought a new, colder geometry to her life. The house remained hers, but the income from Thomas's carpentry vanished with him. Her children, now grown with struggles of their own, offered what they could, but Margaret was proud.
She took in washing, scrubbing other people's stains until her knuckles grew raw. She mended tunics by candlelight. She sold eggs from a few scrawny chickens she fought to keep alive. But the nights were the hardest adjustment. The sleeping platform, once a battleground of elbows and knees, now felt vast and desolate.
She slept on the very edge of her side of the mattress, leaving Thomas's space empty, a shrine to his absence. Without his body heat, the cold became an aggressive invader. She slept fully dressed, piled every rag she owned on top of herself, yet she would wake with numb feet and breath that smoked in the gloom. By 50, her body began to revolt. The ache in her joints, once a dull background hum, became a screaming siren. Her hands throbbed with a rhythmic pulse. Her knees felt as though they were filled with crushed glass. Her back hurt regardless of position, side, stomach, supine. Each offered a different flavor of agony. She would lie in the dark, counting the throbs, terrified by the math of her own mortality. She knew women who lived to 60, even 70. The prospect of 20 more years of these nights felt not like a gift, but a sentence. Sleep became a shallow, treacherous thing. She would drift off only to jolt awake, heart hammering, disoriented, unsure if she had slept for 5 minutes or 5 hours. The darkness offered no clues. One night, at 53, she woke, and the world was gone. For a few terrifying minutes, she did not know where she was, who she was, or why she was in pain. She lay in the void, a consciousness without context, feeling only the cold and the fear. Slowly, like sediment settling in water, the facts returned. She was Margaret. She was a widow. She was old. The night was still here. Fear began to curdle in her mind. Not the fear of thieves, she had nothing left to steal, but a fear of the dark itself. She feared the unstructured hours, the silence that amplified her regrets. She replayed the film of her life, wondering about the daughter she lost, the choices she never really had, the stream of circumstance that had carried her here. She began to keep a candle by the bed. It was an extravagance she couldn't afford, a burning of money, but the need for light was primal. In the deepest trough of the night, when the oppression of the blackness became unbearable, she would strike a light. The small flame would dance, casting long, wavering shadows against the daub walls. She wouldn't think deep philosophical thoughts in that light. She would worry about the fox near the coop, the price of thread, the cough of her grandson. The candle was a small rebellion, a tiny, defiant sun that changed nothing but made the endurance possible. At 57, a strange peace settled over her. She was sleeping less than ever, but it troubled her less. She had simply accepted exhaustion as her baseline state. Pain and fatigue were no longer intruders, they were roommates. Then came the winter night she woke up coughing. It was a familiar sound, deep, wet, and painful. It was Thomas's cough. She lay there, hacking into the freezing air, and felt a strange, detached calm. So, she thought, it begins. The decline was rapid. The cough stole her strength until rising from the pallet became a Herculean task. Her daughters returned, taking shifts by her bedside, reversing the ancient roles. Margaret watched them through half-closed eyes, grateful but guilty, knowing she was now the thief of their sleep, just as her mother had been the thief of hers. Her final memory was not of darkness, but of light. She awoke, or thought she awoke, to see a brilliant golden beam cutting through a crack in the shutter. It wasn't the gray, sickly light of dawn, but the rich, warm gold of afternoon.
She wanted to stand up and open the shutter to let the warmth wash over her, but her body had finally severed its connection to her will. She could only watch the dust motes dancing in the beam.
She died 3 days later, in the mid-afternoon, a rare daytime exit, a final, small defiance against the night. The parish record is brutally concise. Margaret Finch, widow, aged 58 years, buried 14th of March, 1711. It says nothing of the thousands of nights she endured. It does not record the cold, the fear, the grief, or the relentless, grinding fatigue. Her life was aggressively ordinary. She was one of millions whose existence is marked only by a line in a ledger. But her experience was real. Her cold feet were real. Her aching back was real. Her anxiety in the dark was as vivid and consuming as any you have ever felt. Margaret is gone. Her nights are over. But by stepping into her shoes, by feeling the texture of her struggle, we get closer to understanding the true weight of the pre-industrial night. It wasn't just a time of day, it was a physical opponent that wore people down season after season, eroding them like water against stone. As we leave Margaret to her rest, let us drift deeper into the history of the night itself. Beyond individual struggle, how did our ancestors actually use this time? We are entering the realm where history blurs into anthropology, where we must look at a sleep pattern so alien to us, yet so natural to them, that its disappearance is one of the great forgotten shifts in human behavior. For centuries, across Europe and beyond, sleep was not a single solid block. It was broken in two. This was the era of segmented sleep, a time of the first sleep and the second sleep. And to our ancestors, this midnight waking was as normal as lunch. People would retreat to their beds not long after the sun surrendered the sky, driven there by the bone-deep fatigue of physical labor. They would collapse into a profound, heavy slumber, a state often described in the texts of the time as dead sleep. This was the first sleep, or premier sommeil. It was the anchor of the night, the deep restorative dive that scrubbed the mind and body of the day's toil. But then, something curious would happen. Around midnight, or perhaps an hour later, they would wake. This was not a startled waking caused by a noise or a nightmare. It was a natural biological surfacing, as reliable as the tide. This period of wakefulness, often lasting an hour, sometimes 2 or 3, was not viewed as a disorder. It was not insomnia to be medicated or fretted over. It was simply the intermission of the night, as expected as the dusk that preceded it and the dawn that would follow. In this quiet interval, sometimes called the watch or the door veil, wake, sleep, the darkness took on a texture different from the terrifying void of deep night. It became a time of use. People filled these formless hours with quiet, deliberate life. For the pious, it was a time for the soul. Prayer books and breviaries from the medieval and early modern periods are filled with specific prayers for the night watch, liturgies designed to be whispered in the dark, acknowledging the unique vulnerability of the hour. For the anxious, it was a time of mental accounting. Lying in the dark, a farmer might calculate the grain stores, a merchant might rethink a negotiation, turning over problems that the sensory overload of daylight had obscured. For the practical, there was work to be done. A master of the house might rise to tend the fire, carefully navigating the balance between keeping the embers alive and not sparking a blaze that would consume the thatch. Others would check the livestock, moving through the barn with the muscle memory of a lifetime, listening for the breathing of cattle or the shifting of horses. And for many, it was a time of intimacy. In the crowded, shared beds of history, the watch provided a rare bubble of privacy. This was the hour for the curtain lecture, quiet conversations between spouses that daylight was too busy to permit. The darkness acted as a confessional.
Without the ability to see one another's faces, social masks slipped away. Fears could be voiced without shame, affection could be whispered without embarrassment. Plans were hatched, grievances aired, and children conceived in this quiet interlude between sleeps. Eventually, the heaviness would return. The second sleep would descend, usually in the early hours of the morning. This second phase was often described as lighter, more filled with dreams, a shallow drift that carried the sleeper toward the gray light of dawn. When the rooster crowed or the church bell rang, the household would rise, shaking off the morning heaviness to begin the cycle again. We know this pattern existed because the past has left us crumbs of evidence. It appears in the margins of literature, in the dry language of court records, and in the advice of doctors. A character in the Canterbury Tales wakes from her first sleep and lies awake. The narrator treats this not as a plot point, but as a mundane detail of life. In legal depositions from the 1600s, witnesses casually mention seeing a crime committed in the time between the two sleeps, a time frame that required no further explanation to the judge. Medical manuals from the Renaissance advised couples that the best time for conception was after the first sleep, when the body was rested and the mind clear. However, history is often written by the literate, and the literate were few. We have mountains of evidence from England, France, and colonial America, writings from people who owned paper and ink. But what of the illiterate majority? Did the shepherd in the highlands or the serf in Russia follow this same rhythm? Did the Mediterranean peasant, blessedly free of the Nordic chill, sleep differently? We assume the biological imperative was universal, but the nuances of class and geography remain shadowed. What we do know is that the night possessed a dimension of wakefulness that has been erased from our modern lives. The gap between first and second sleep was a legitimate territory of time, a recognized country with its own customs and expectations. So, where did it go? The death of segmented sleep was a slow murder committed by technology. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th and 19th, the night began to lose its power. First came better candles, then whale oil lamps, then the bright, steady glare of gaslight, and finally the electric bulb. Artificial light allowed the day to colonize the night. We pushed our bedtimes later, compressing our rest into a single solid block. The Industrial Revolution demanded a workforce that functioned like machinery, standardized, efficient, and timed by the clock rather than the sun. Waking in the middle of the night, once a time for prayer or romance, became a pathology. We gave it a clinical name, maintenance insomnia. We created pills to cure it, marketing unbroken unconsciousness as the only definition of health. We took a natural rhythm of the human animal and turned it into a medical failure. But for Margaret, and for the millions who lived before the light bulb, that waking hour was simply the texture of reality. It was not romantic. It was often cold, boring, and uncomfortable, but it was theirs. It was accommodated, not fought. Now, let us push further into the dark. We must understand that for our ancestors, darkness was not merely the absence of photons. It was a physical and spiritual state, a distinct realm with its own physics and its own inhabitants.
Night was the time when the veil between worlds grew thin. The rigid boundaries of the material world, so solid under the noon sun, became permeable. If you believed in spirits, in demons, in fairies, or in the restless dead, and almost everyone did, night was their domain. Darkness provided the cover necessary for the supernatural to bleed into the natural.
This was not superstition in the way we use the word today as a silly belief to be debunked. It was a survival framework. It was a way of organizing a terrifying world. When you heard a footstep in an empty room, or saw a shadow detach itself from the wall, or felt a sudden inexplicable chill, you needed a system to explain it. The alternative, that the world was chaotic and meaningless, was too frightening to bear. In the Christian worldview of medieval and early modern Europe, night was a moral battlefield. Light was God, darkness was the adversary. To be awake and alone in the deep night was to be spiritually exposed. The darkness was teeming with powers of the air, fallen entities that sought to snare the soul when the defenses of the day were down. This is why the church bells rang. In monasteries across Christendom, bells tolled the canonical hours throughout the night, matins and lauds breaking the silence. These weren't just timekeepers, they were spiritual alarms, acoustic weapons deployed to drive back the demons and remind the faithful lying shivering in their beds that the vigilance of the spirit was the only defense against the crushing weight of the dark.
For those lying staring at the thatch, the tolling of a distant church bell was more than a timekeeper. It was a sonic lifeline. It reassured the listener that they were not abandoned in the void. Somewhere, in a cold stone abbey or a village parish, monks and priests were maintaining the night watch, chanting the offices of matins and lauds. The sound declared that the forces of light had not ceded the territory entirely to the dark. Human voices were still speaking to heaven, even when the eyes could see nothing. In a worldview defined by constant spiritual warfare, this was a specific tactical comfort. The garrison was awake, and the perimeter was held. While the church offered bells, other traditions held different, equally potent maps of the night. For many cultures, darkness was the time of the thinning, when the laws of physics bowed to the laws of the spirit. It was the hour when ancestors walked the floors of their former homes, observing the lives of their descendants. It was the domain of the fair folk in the British Isles, or the domovoi in Slavic lands, entities that were not necessarily evil, but capricious, requiring respect and propitiation.
To survive the night was to navigate a minefield of unseen rules. You did not just lock your door, you sealed it with ritual. A piece of iron placed above the threshold to repel fairies, a line of salt to bind spirits, a prayer muttered 3 times before blowing out the light. What united these diverse beliefs was a single, terrifying understanding. The night was not neutral. It was not simply time waiting for morning. It was a distinct state of existence, an alternate dimension that overlaid the day, requiring a completely different set of behaviors to survive. Even if you stripped away the supernatural, the dark was weaponized by practical dangers. A simple misstep in a pitch-black room could result in a broken bone, an injury that, in the pre-modern world, could mean permanent disability or a slow death from infection. Fire was the apex predator of the night. A spark flying from an unchecked hearth could ignite a straw mattress or a thatched roof in seconds, consuming a timber-framed house and everyone inside before they could wake. And then there were the intruders, thieves looking for an easy score, or wolves and bears drawn by the scent of livestock. Survival demanded vigilance, a low-level, simmering alertness that prevented the brain from ever fully powering down. But vigilance is an expensive fuel. To maintain it night after night, shivering in the cold, is psychologically corrosive. In the absence of sensory input, the mind begins to hallucinate threats. The brain, starving for data, engages in pareidolia, turning a pile of clothes into a crouching figure, or the creak of a rafter into a footstep. This is why the objects of the night became totems of such profound importance. They were not merely tools, they were anchors of sanity. Consider the candle. To us, it is a mood setter, a decoration. To our ancestors, it was a captive star. It was a sphere of influence carved out of the abyss, a radius of visibility where chaos could be held at bay. The ability to command light, even a flickering, pathetic lumen, was a form of power in a world where humanity was largely helpless against the elements. But light was a luxury. Beeswax candles, which burned clean and smelled of honey, were the exclusive preserve of the church and the aristocracy. For the ordinary peasant, the reality was tallow, rendered animal fat, usually from sheep or cows. Tallow candles were brown, greasy to the touch, and smelled of frying meat or rancid fat when they burned. They were dip candles, made by tediously dipping a wick into cooling grease over and over again.
And they were expensive. A pound of candles could cost a laborer half a day's wages. Because of this, light was rationed with military precision. You did not burn a candle to relax, you burned it to work. You lit it to spin wool, to mend a plow harness, or to nurse a sick child. The moment the task was done, the flame was pinched out. The wick, often made of twisted hemp or rush, required constant maintenance. It had to be snuffed or trimmed every 20 minutes, or the flame would gutter, smoke furiously, and waste precious fuel. For the poorest, even tallow was too dear. They relied on rushlights, reeds stripped of their outer bark, dipped in skimmed grease, and clamped in a simple iron holder. They burned fast and dim, a fragile line of light that required constant attention. Then there was the oil lamp, a technology as old as civilization. These varied wildly by geography. In coastal regions, they burned fish oil or whale oil, cheap and bright, but producing a pungent, fishy stench that permeated clothes and hair. Inland, they burned vegetable oils like rapeseed or olive oil, which were cleaner but often dimmer. The lamps themselves were marvels of domestic engineering. The cruisy lamp, common in Scotland and northern Europe, featured two iron bowls, one to hold the oil and wick, and a second beneath it to catch the inevitable drips, ensuring not a drop of fuel was wasted.
Some were designed with covers to shield the flame from drafts as they were carried across a windy farmyard. Others, the Betty lamps, had wicks suspended in a channel to burn fat more efficiently. The archaeology of lighting tells a story of intimate use. Excavated candle holders show iron handles polished to a mirror sheen by the oils of thousands of human hands gripping them night after night. Chemical analysis of residue in ancient lamps reveals the desperation of fuel choices: rancid butter, rendered badger fat, anything that would burn. These objects were the most handled items in the home, passed down through generations, not for their beauty, but for their necessity. A broken candlestick was not thrown away, it was soldered, patched, and bent back into shape, because to be without a holder was to be without light. Finally, there was the bed itself. In probate inventories, the lists of assets made after a death, the bed was frequently the single most valuable item a family owned, often worth more than all the livestock combined. For the wealthy, the bed was a room within a room. The four-poster design was not an aesthetic choice, it was an insulation system. Heavy wool or velvet curtains could be drawn tight, trapping the body heat of the sleepers inside and creating a microclimate significantly warmer than the rest of the drafty house. This fabric fortress offered acoustic dampening,
granting a semblance of privacy in a house full of servants and family. It created a psychological safe zone, a cubic solitude where the sleeper was protected from both the cold and the gaze of the world. But for the vast majority, the bed was far simpler, and the experience of it far more communal. We have already met the straw mattress, that humble sack of dry stalks. But consider its lifespan. It was not a static object, it was a decaying organic mass. Over weeks of use, the straw would pulverize into dust, compress into hard ridges, and begin to rot from the moisture of sweat and the damp air. It required regular purging. The old straw, now teeming with fleas and mites, would be dragged out and burned or composted, replaced by fresh threshing. In the poorest households, there was no sack at all, simply loose rushes strewn on the beaten earth floor, a bed that was little more than a nest, changed only when the smell became overpowering or the insect population made sleep impossible. In this world, the blanket was not merely an accessory, it was a form of currency. Probate inventories, the lists of goods made after a death, frequently rank blankets alongside livestock and tools as a family's most precious assets. Wool was the material of survival.
In a time before central heating, wool's miraculous ability to retain heat even when damp made it indispensable. A household's status could be read in its wool. Thick, tightly woven blankets for the master and mistress, thinner, darned and patched cast-offs for the children, and for the servants, often just a single threadbare rag to be used as a wrap in the coldest months. Linen sheets were a different matter entirely. If they existed in a home, they were symbols of genuine wealth. To possess linen required a long chain of labor, the cultivation of flax, the rotting of the stalks, the breaking, the spinning, and the weaving. To feel the cool, smooth touch of linen against the skin was a luxury reserved for the wedding night, the deathbed, or the very rich. For the rest, the scratch of wool against skin was the texture of the night. Then there is the nightcap. In our modern imagination, it is a comical trope, Dickens's Scrooge in his floppy hat. But in the 17th century, it was a vital piece of survival gear. In a room where your breath clouded in the air, 40% of your body heat could vanish through your scalp.
The nightcap plugged that thermal leak. It also served a hygienic function, absorbing the oils and sweat of unwashed hair, protecting the precious bedding from soiling that would require laborious laundering. Putting on the cap was a psychological trigger, a ritual marker signaling that the domain of the day was closed and the vulnerability of sleep had begun. Regarding sleepwear, the concept of pajamas, garments specifically purchased and reserved for sleeping, was a luxury most could not fathom. Some wealthy individuals owned loose-fitting night rails or gowns, but the vast majority slept in their shifts or chemises, the linen undergarments they wore during the day, or simply slept in their day clothes, loosening a belt or unlacing a bodice to allow for breath. The rigid categorization of clothing, this is for gym, this is for work, this is for sleep, is a modern invention born of cheap textiles and abundant storage. In Margaret's world, you wore what you owned. In the dark, the sense of touch became paramount, and small objects took on immense spiritual weight. A rosary, a wooden cross, or a small icon became a physical anchor in the blackness. These items were handled before sleep, clutched during the wakeful watch, and reached for when the fear rose. For the believer, they were not just wood and beads, they were conduits, grounding rods that drew divine protection into the room when the eyes could no longer verify safety. The night also demanded a specific kind of literacy,
acoustic literacy. You had to learn the language of your house. You learned that the sharp crack from the roof was just the oak beams contracting in the frost, not a footstep. You learned that the scratching in the thatch was the wind lifting a loose bundle of reeds, not a thief removing the roof. This background noise was the silence of the home. You only noticed it when it stopped. A house that went suddenly perfectly quiet was a house that was holding its breath. Beyond the walls, the animal world provided a perimeter alarm system. If the cows in the attached byre shifted restlessly, stamping their hooves, it might mean nothing, or it might mean a wolf was circling the building. If the dogs began to bark, you had to parse the sound. Was it the bored, rhythmic barking of a dog answering another dog 3 miles away? Or was it the sharp, chaotic frenzy of a dog confronting an intruder? Human sounds, too, behaved differently in the cold night air. Without the dampening effect of daytime bustle, the acoustic horizon expanded. On a still, frozen night, the crunch of a boot on hard earth could be heard half a mile away. You could hear a neighbor coughing 2 houses down. You could hear the latch of a door lifting across the lane. The village at night was an acoustic map. You knew who was awake, who was sick, and who was moving where they shouldn't be. But silence was the most unsettling sound of all. Total silence felt unnatural, heavy. It implied that the normal rustle of life had been suppressed by a predator. It triggered a primal alarm in the brain. Why has the forest gone quiet? In this sensory deprivation, the human imagination, fueled by exhaustion and evolution, ran wild. The brain is a pattern-matching machine designed to keep you alive, not to keep you calm. In the dark, it engages in hypervigilance. It takes ambiguous data, a shadow in the corner, a creak on the stair, and forces it into a shape that makes sense. Usually, that shape is a threat. A draft becomes a presence, a cold spot that feels like a ghost standing at your shoulder. A flicker at the edge of your peripheral vision, where the eye is most sensitive to motion but terrible at detail, becomes a crouching figure. This is not madness, it is evolutionary logic. If you hear a twig snap and assume it's a tiger, but it's just the wind, you lose a little sleep. If you assume it's the wind, but it's a tiger, you die. Evolution has wired us to err on the side of terror. So, the nights of history were populated by things that hovered between reality and hallucination. For people like Margaret, exhausted by 12 hours of labor and malnourished by modern standards, the line between what is there and what I imagine was porous. Over decades of broken sleep, the phantoms of the mind became as real as the cold in the room. Let us turn briefly to what historians and archaeologists have found, and more importantly, what they have not found. When archaeologists sift through the debris of the past, looking for the physical remains of the night, they find a frustrating emptiness. The material culture of darkness is ghost-like. By its very nature, it is designed to vanish. Think about the objects we have discussed. A candle is a tool created to consume itself. It burns down to nothing, leaving perhaps a smear of wax that bacteria will eat within weeks. Oil evaporates from lamps, leaving only chemical ghosts. Straw mattresses do not survive the centuries. They rot, return to the earth, or are burned when they become too foul to keep. Wooden bed frames, unless preserved in a bog or a desert, end up as firewood the moment they crack. What survives is the hardware, not the software. We find the brass candlestick, the iron lamp hook, the copper bed warmer, the durable, recyclable skeletons of the night. These metal artifacts tell us about metallurgy, about craft, about aesthetic style, but they are mute on the subject of experience. An iron lamp can show us how it was made, but it cannot tell us the relief a mother felt when the flame finally caught,
pushing back a terrifying shadow. It cannot convey the panic of a wick sputtering out when a child is crying in the dark. We can hold the object, but we cannot hold the feeling. Documentary evidence gives us a little more light, but it is a spotlight that shines only on the literate few. We have diaries from wealthy merchants complaining of sleeplessness. We have medical treatises from physicians pontificating on night terrors. We have literature where characters move through stylized nights that serve the plot rather than the truth. Perhaps the most honest glimpses come from the dry records of the law. In court depositions, ordinary people, often illiterate witnesses whose words were transcribed by clerks, accidentally reveal the texture of their lives. A witness might say, "I heard the scream after my first sleep," casually confirming the existence of segmented sleep as a universal reference point. A defendant might offer an alibi, "I was in bed waiting for the cock to crow." These legal snapshots capture the acoustic reality of the night, the sounds, the fears, the rhythms frozen in ink. But for the vast majority, the millions of peasants, laborers, and servants, the night has swallowed their stories. We are left to reconstruct their darkness through inference, educated guessing, and the stubborn persistence of human nature. One of the most profound differences between their night and ours is the crushing weight of temporal uncertainty. Imagine waking up in the pitch black. In the modern world, you tap a screen or glance at a glowing alarm clock. You know instantly it is 3:14 a.m. You can calculate exactly how much sleep you have lost and how much remains. For our ancestors, time in the dark was a shapeless void. Without a mechanical clock chimes, which were rare in private homes until surprisingly recently, how did you know where you stood in the long march toward morning? You guessed. You relied on felt time. You learned to read the density of the blackness. The heavy, suffocating dark of midnight feels different from the thinning gray of the pre-dawn, though it is hard to say exactly why. You listened for the rhythms of nature, the rooster, who is notoriously an unreliable timekeeper, the shifting of cattle who know when feeding time approaches, the temperature drop that heralds the dawn. But mostly, you simply did not know. You existed in a state of suspension. When you woke, had you slept for 1 hour or 6? If you went back to sleep, would you oversleep and miss the start of the harvest? If you stayed awake, were you facing 1 hour of boredom or 5 hours of freezing solitude? This uncertainty bred a specific kind of anxiety. Sleep vigilance kept many people in a shallow state of rest, a part of their brain always listening for the morning bell or the stirrings of the household. Yet, humans are masters of adaptation. They learned to surrender to the uncertainty, to accept the night as a tunnel with no distance markers, trusting that the exit would appear when it appeared. So, was this segmented sleep, this first and second sleep, universal? Historians are still arguing. Some claim it was the standard biological rhythm of the human species before electricity broke us. Others suggest it was cultural or geographic, a habit of the cold northern latitudes where nights were 14 hours long, and lying in bed for that duration without a break was physically impossible. Perhaps in the warm Mediterranean or near the equator where day and night are balanced, the rhythm was different. The truth, as it usually does, likely lies in the messy middle. Human biology is not a robot's code. It is flexible, bending to the pressures of climate, culture, and labor. But one thing is certain. The night of the past was not an option. It was an absolute regime. Today, we treat darkness as a setting we can toggle. We banish it with a flick of a switch. We push the night back, colonize it with screens and streetlights, and turn it into a slightly dimmer version of the day.
For Margaret, and for all those who came before us, the night was a physical geography that had to be traversed. It was a daily siege. It required preparation, defense, and endurance. Every evening the sun failed. Every evening the world shrank to the radius of a tallow candle. And every evening they lay down in the straw, closed their eyes against the cold, and waited for the return of the light. The psychological weight of this reality cannot be overstated, nor can it be fully grasped by those of us who have only known darkness as a choice. For the modern human, night is a theoretical concept, an aesthetic setting we control with dimmer switches rather than an imposed sentence. We possess the godlike power to flood a room with lumens brighter than noon at 3 a.m. We know the time to the precise second.
We set digital sentinels to wake us. We distract our anxious minds with an infinite stream of glowing entertainment, ensuring we never have to endure the terrifying silence of our own thoughts unless we volunteer for it. For our ancestors, the night was a prison from which there was no parole. Every single day ended in a darkness that could not be negotiated with, only slightly mitigated by the burning of expensive fat. Every night brought the same trilogy of suffering, cold, discomfort, and the crushing weight of unmeasured time. There was no scrolling through a feed to defer sleep. There was no binge-watching to distract from the silence. There was only the void. The cumulative effect of enduring thousands of such nights shaped the human consciousness in ways we can barely conceive from our vantage point of electric abundance. Sleep was never taken for granted because it was never guaranteed. It was a resource that had to be mined from rock. Rest was never truly complete because the conditions for deep, REM-heavy recovery simply did not exist. Between the biting cold, the gnawing lice, the fear of fire, and the aches of labor, the body learned to function in a permanent state of low-level exhaustion. Humanity spent millennia chronically sleep-deprived, adapting to a fog of fatigue without ever realizing that life could be lived any other way.
This was the fundamental rhythm of the species. The sun set, bringing a darkness that was anticipated with dread, but accepted with resignation. People retreated to their nests, obeying a curfew set by the rotation of the planet. They drifted into the first sleep, surfacing later into the watch, lying in the blackness until the second sleep dragged them under again. Then the dawn, then the labor. Season after season, the wheel turned. Winter nights were endurance tests of freezing darkness. Summer nights were sweltering battles against insects. But the core experience remained immutable, the slow, suffocating passage of time that could not be counted. Imagine yourself back there one last time. Strip away every convenience you know. No switch to banish the shadows. No thermostat to regulate the air. No glowing clock face to tell you the dawn is only an hour away. No distraction. Just you, the dark, and the silence. You are lying on a sack of crushed stalks that poke through the thin hemp sheet. The cold is a physical weight on your chest. You hear a sound. Is it a rat or a thief? You must assess it, adrenaline spiking, then try to lower your heart rate again.
This was not poverty. This was humanity. This was not a punishment for the few. It was the standard operating procedure for the many. The quiet struggle, repeated night after night, shaped the people who came before us. They loved, feared, dreamed, and died within this rhythm. We are the soft descendants of those hard nights, carrying the legacy of their endurance in our DNA. But now, let us shift our gaze. Let us leave the cold, daub-walled cottage of the widow Margaret and turn our attention to the few who possessed the resources to negotiate a truce with the night. They could not escape the darkness. No amount of gold could buy a light bulb in 1700. But they could soften its teeth. They could build fortresses of comfort to hold the night at bay. The aristocratic bedchamber was a fundamentally different universe than the one-room dwelling of the peasant. It was a specialized sanctuary, a room designated solely for the act of rest, segregated from the smells of cooking, the noise of livestock, and the traffic of the day. The bed itself was not furniture, it was architecture. It was a massive structure of carved oak or walnut, raised high off the floor to escape the bad air and the drafts that snaked along the flagstones.
The mattress was not a sack of chaff, but a tick filled with the softest goose down or feathers, shaken daily by servants to ensure loft and softness. It yielded to the body, holding it in a cloud rather than bruising it against boards. The bedding was a textural landscape of wealth. Instead of the scratch of raw wool, the skin touched fine linen sheets that had been laundered and pressed with lavender. Blankets were of the tightest, softest weave. Coverlets of silk, velvet, or damask added heavy insulation and visual splendor. Pillows, luxuries in themselves, cradled the head. But the defining technology of the aristocratic night was the curtain. These were not merely decorative drapes. The tester bed, with its wooden roof and heavy velvet hangings, was a machine for warmth. When the curtains were drawn tight, the sleeper was enclosed in a room within a room. The heavy fabric acted as thermal insulation, trapping the body heat of the occupants and creating a microclimate that could be 10 degrees warmer than the frigid air of the chamber beyond. Inside this fabric box, the air was still. The drafts were silenced. The vast, shadowy corners of the room were blocked from view. It felt womb-like, a protective retreat where the sleeper was physically walled off from the vulnerability of the night.
Yet we must not romanticize even this. The velvet could block the draft, but it could not block the darkness. Once the bedside candle was snuffed out, the aristocrat faced the same absolute blackness as the peasant. The silence inside the curtains was deeper, perhaps, but the night still pressed against the fabric, waiting. Cold still penetrated despite the velvet barriers. Bodies still ached with age or illness, minds still circled with worries, and rest was still broken. But the quality of the suffering was different. It was discomfort experienced in relative warmth, in softness, and, crucially, with the knowledge that help was a whisper away. The presence of servants fundamentally altered the physics of the night. An aristocrat who woke cold could have the fire stoked. One who woke thirsty could have wine brought. The burden of maintaining the environment fell to others whose own sleep was a secondary concern. A lady's maid might sleep on a pallet at the foot of the great bed, or a valet just outside the door, ears tuned for the chime of a silver bell. The great houses were never truly silent. They hummed with a low-level frequency of vigilance, distributed among a staff whose job was to be the night watch.
And then there was the light. Wealthy households commanded an arsenal of illumination. Beeswax candles, burning clean and golden, could be lit in clusters, creating pools of genuine brightness rather than the single smoky point of light in a cottage. Candelabras extended the day well past sunset, allowing for reading, needlework, and conversation. Some homes even boasted argand lamps, complex devices with glass chimneys that magnified the flame. The rich could buy time. They could push back the curfew of the sun. But eventually, even the longest candle burns down. Eventually, the household retired. And eventually, the same fundamental uncertainty of the dark hours settled over the manor as surely as it did over the hovel. Let us step into a winter night in such a household. Let us feel the texture of privilege in the dark. The evening begins in the dining hall, warmed by a roaring hearth that consumes a forest's worth of wood. Dinner is a pageant of courses, wine, and conversation that defies the howling wind outside. But as the hours wear on, the cold begins its siege. It seeps through the stone walls and sneaks under the tapestries. Feet grow numb in silk slippers. The family retreats to a smaller, more defensible room, a solar or drawing room, where the heat is concentrated. But finally, the chill wins. The decision is made to retire. Upstairs, an army of invisible hands has prepared the battlefield. Servants have warmed the sheets with copper pans filled with hot coals. They have turned down the heavy coverlets. They have ensured the chamber pots are empty and the water jugs full. The lady of the house enters her chamber, followed by her shadow, the maid. The preparation for bed is a ritual of unmaking. It is nothing like Margaret shedding a single tunic. It is a complex excavation. The outer gown, the kirtle, the stiffened stays that reshape the torso, the shift. The maid's hands move with practiced efficiency, unlacing and unhooking, while the lady stands passive, shivering slightly despite the fire. A nightgown of fine linen or silk is draped over her, warmth without weight. Her hair is unbound and brushed, covered by a delicate cap. She climbs the steps to the high bed, slipping between sheets that still hold the ghost of the warming pan's heat. The maid tucks the blankets around her with the precision of an upholsterer, building layers of insulation. Then the final seal. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn around the bed, leaving only a sliver of a gap for air. The maid retreats to her pallet in the corner, fully dressed, ready to spring up at a sound. A single candle is left burning in a sconce by the door, a nightlight to keep the total void at bay.
For a time, the lady lies in luxury. The mattress is a cloud of feathers. The linen is smooth against her skin. She is in a warm fabric womb, cut off from the drafty cavern of the room. But comfort is relative. The air inside the curtains is still cold, cold enough that the tip of her nose goes numb. Her breath puffs in white clouds when she exhales. She buries her face in the pillow to create a pocket of warm air, but then it feels stuffy. She shifts, finding the balance between freezing and suffocating. Sleep comes easier here than on Margaret's straw, but the mind is a democrat. It troubles the rich as much as the poor. Lying in the dark, the softness of the mattress cannot soften the sharp edges of anxiety. She worries about the estate accounts, about her son's fever, about the slight in her husband's tone at dinner. Her husband sleeps in his own chamber down the hall. Separate beds were a luxury of the elite. She exists in an enclosed darkness, warm but isolated, protected but alone. She drifts off, but the night is long, and the watch comes for her too.
She wakes hours later. What was it? A timber settling? A servant's footstep? Or just the natural end of the first sleep? She lies disoriented in the pitch black of the curtained bed. She cannot see her hand in front of her face. She calls out, "Agnes!" From the corner, a rustle. "Yes, my lady." "The pot." The maid rises, strikes a flint to light a taper from the door candle, and brings the light to the bedside. She pulls back the velvet curtain. The sudden flare of light is blinding to eyes adjusted to absolute dark. The lady slides out of the warm nest, her feet hitting the cold floorboards. The maid stands discreetly by, holding the light, averting her eyes. It is an intimate, awkward transaction, bodily necessity meeting professional duty. Task done, the lady scrambles back into the warmth. The maid removes the pot, snuffs the taper, and returns to her corner. The curtains are drawn. The darkness snaps back into place. But now she is awake. The interruption has dragged her fully back to consciousness. She lies there, listening to the silence of the great house. And then, from somewhere deep in the hall, A clock chimes. This is the ultimate luxury of the age. Mechanical clocks, though temperamental and staggeringly expensive, began to appear in the private chambers of the nobility from the late medieval period onward. The sound of the chime transforms the night. It domesticates the void. The lady counts the strikes. 1, 2, 3. It is 3 a.m. In the folklore of the time, this is the wolf hour, the deepest, most spiritual trough of the night. Knowing this offers a strange paradox. On one hand, it is grounding. The shapeless dark has been given a name and a number. On the other hand, it is oppressive. She knows with mathematical certainty that dawn is still hours away. The clock has quantified her insomnia. She tries to sink back into the feathers, but now the Princess and the Pea effect takes hold. She notices a wrinkle in the linen sheet. She feels a draft where the heavy coverlet has slipped a fraction of an inch. A dull ache in her shoulder. Is it just a cramped muscle, or the first whisper of the gout that plagues her husband? Her mind begins to spin the wheel of the night. The darkness acts as a magnifying glass for anxiety. She worries about the estate's yield, her daughter's marriage prospects, a slight she perceived at dinner. In the daylight, these are manageable tasks. At 3:15 a.m., they are insurmountable catastrophes. Time, though measured by the clock, drags. She drifts into a shallow, fitful doze, the second sleep arriving not as a deep ocean, but as a shallow puddle. When she wakes next, the quality of the darkness has shifted. It is not yet light, but the absolute ink-black sovereignty of the night has cracked. It is the false dawn. She lies still, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the maid in the corner and the popping of cooling timber in the walls. Gradually, the grayness wins. The heavy velvet curtains can no longer keep the morning out. When the light is strong enough to distinguish the shape of the furniture, she calls out. The day begins. The ritual of rising is an elaborate choreography. The chamber pot, the basin of cold water, or perhaps lukewarm if the kitchen staff is efficient. The dressing process is the reverse of the night before, a layering of linen and silk and wool. Her night is over. It was not comfortable by modern standards. The room was freezing, the sleep was broken, the mind was anxious. But compared to Margaret, waking on a damp straw sack with aching joints and no servant to bring a towel, the lady has slept in paradise. But let us consider a different kind of night, one where wealth can buy care, but it cannot buy immunity. The night of the sickbed. The lady has fallen ill. It is a fever, a tertian ague, perhaps. Her body burns, yet she shivers. In this state, the bedchamber transforms from a sanctuary into a hospital. The rhythm of the room shifts to a high-alert vigil. The maid does not sleep on her pallet tonight. She sits in a high-backed chair by the bed, fighting her own exhaustion, eyes fixed on her mistress. A second servant is brought in solely to feed the fire, keeping the room at a tropical temperature that defies the winter outside. The heavy bed curtains are pinned back, allowing the maid to monitor the patient's breathing. A beeswax candle, perhaps even a lamp with a steady flame, burns all night, banishing the shadows that feverish minds might turn into monsters. The lady is not alone. She is cocooned in a web of attention. Yet biology is a cruel leveler. The fever makes the expensive feather mattress feel like a bed of stones. She is sweating, then freezing. Her thoughts fracture into delirium. The maid is there with a cool cloth dipped in vinegar and rosewater, speaking in a low, soothing hum. This is the true value of wealth in the pre-industrial night, not just the softness of the bed, but the purchase of another human being's wakefulness. The maid absorbs the labor of the illness, so the lady can focus only on endurance.
When morning finally breaks, bringing the physician with his uroscopy flask and his Latin phrases, the relief is palpable. The sun makes the fever seem less malevolent. But the night has been an ordeal, a tunnel traversed inch by inch. Now shift your imagination to the road. Consider the aristocratic traveler. Travel in the centuries before the railway was a grueling exercise in logistics and discomfort, but money cushioned the blow. The wealthy traveler did not sleep in the common room of the inn, a chaotic space where strangers slept 3 to a bed and lice were the only permanent residents. He purchased a private chamber. Yet the traveler's night is defined by a specific psychological strain, hypervigilance. The room smells of strange smoke and old lavender. The bed, though expensive, has the unfamiliar contours of 1,000 previous sleepers. The door has a lock, an iron box lock, but is it pickable? Are the innkeeper's sons honest? He lies in the dark, constructing an acoustic map of the unknown. The rumble of a cart outside, the whinny of a horse in the stable yard, the heavy footfall of a drunkard in the hallway. Every creak is a potential threat. Every silence is suspicious. Even wrapped in his own silk sheets brought from home, he sleeps with one hand near the dagger on the bedside table. Wealth can buy privacy, but it cannot buy the peace of familiar walls.
Finally, let us move from the secular to the sacred. Let us enter the world of institutional sleep. For the monks and nuns in the great abbeys of Europe, the night was not a time of rest to be maximized, but a spiritual resource to be mined. Their sleep was engineered, regulated by the rule of Saint Benedict, and intentionally shattered. The monks retired early after the service of Compline, usually around 8 p.m. They slept in a dormitory or individual cells, falling into a deep, exhausted slumber. But this sleep was a ticking timer. At midnight or shortly after, the great bell of the monastery would toll. This was the call to matins, the night office. Imagine the physical discipline required. The bell rings in the dead of winter. The monk rises from his pallet, shaking with cold. He does not light a candle. He knows the path by heart. He walks through the stone corridors, the flagstones leaching the heat from his sandaled feet, until he reaches the chapel. For the next hour or more, the night is filled with the drone of chanting, Domine, labia mea aperies, Lord, open my lips. They stand in the flickering light of the altar candles, breath smoking in the freezing air, fighting the overwhelming urge to collapse. This is the Opus Dei, the work of God. They are keeping the world turning with their prayers while the laity sleeps. When the office is finished, they return to their cells for the second sleep, drifting off until the bell for lauds rings at dawn. This was not an occasional hardship. It was the architecture of their entire lives. For the young novice, it was a test of will. For the elderly monk, it was a physical torture. Years of broken sleep and freezing stone floors calcified their joints and weakened their hearts. Yet within the monastery walls, this sleep deprivation was framed as a virtue. To deny the body rest was to feed the spirit. To wake in the dark was to prove that one belonged to a kingdom that did not rely on the sun. The sacrifice of comfort, the willingness to sever the thread of sleep for prayer, the acceptance of the cold stone floor, these were not inconveniences to be managed, they were medals of spiritual seriousness. The difficulty was the point. The convents of Europe followed a similar rigorous geometry of time.
For the nuns, the experience was often compounded by the belief that the female body was colder and more prone to humors, yet they were often granted less fuel and fewer calories than their male counterparts. The midnight office might be slightly abbreviated, but the fundamental architecture of their night was the same. Sleep interrupted by the bell, prayers whispered in the freezing dark, and a life lived in a rhythm dictated by the church rather than the body.
Let us now march from the cloister to the garrison. Consider the military night. Soldiers stationed in the border forts of Rome, the castles of medieval France, or the outposts of the colonial frontier lived in communities where sleep was structured not by God, but by the threat of death. For the century, the night was a sleepless endurance test. Standing guard on a rampart in driving rain or biting frost, fighting the biological imperative to close one's eyes, knowing that a moment of weakness could mean the throat-slitting of one's comrades or a court-martial at dawn. For the soldiers off duty, sleep took place in the barracks, a communal squalor that stripped away all human dignity. Men lay in rows, bodies pressed together for warmth on lice-ridden straw. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, leather, and rust. Silence was a myth. The room was a symphony of snoring, coughing, and the tossing of restless men. In this environment, light sleep was a survival skill. The military night was built on the assumption of imminent catastrophe. At any second, a trumpet might sound, or a shout might ring out. A soldier had to go from deep REM sleep to armed combat readiness in the span of a heartbeat. This hypervigilance took a brutal toll. Chronic sleep deprivation was the standard condition of the soldier. They were irritable, slow-witted, and physically wrecked by the time they were 30.
The officers naturally fared better. They slept in private quarters with decent beds, but even they slept with one ear cocked toward the door, subject to the sudden arrival of a courier or the alarm bell. In war, no one truly sleeps. Step back now and look at the mosaic we have assembled. The aristocratic manor, the frozen monastery, the crowded barracks, the peasant's hovel. Across all these diverse contexts, a singular truth emerges. The night was the great leveler. Wealth and privilege could soften the edges of the experience, but they could not alter its core reality. A goose-down mattress is objectively more comfortable than a sack of straw, but it cannot stop the mind from eating itself in the silence. A candelabra provides more lumens than a rushlight, but eventually the wax runs out, and the physics of the universe dictates that darkness returns. The fundamental conditions of the pre-industrial night, its crushing length, its absolute darkness, its biting cold, and its temporal uncertainty, were shared across every stratum of society. The King of France, shivering in Versailles when the fire died down, was closer in experience to the peasant in the field than he is to you, sitting in your climate-controlled room today. Even the most powerful people on Earth could not hurry the sun. They could not check a smartphone to see that only 20 minutes remained until dawn. They had to wait. This is why the dawn held such profound, universal significance. In our world, sunrise is a traffic inconvenience or an aesthetic moment for Instagram. For them, it was a rescue. It meant the siege was lifted. It meant visibility, warmth, and the return of the known world. So imagine yourself one last time in that high, curtained bed. You are surrounded by velvet and silk. A clock has just chimed the quarter hour. A servant is breathing softly in the corner. You are warm. You are safe. And yet you are alone. The darkness still presses against your eyes. The silence still amplifies your heartbeat.
Morning is still 3 hours away, and no amount of gold can buy a fast-forward button. You must simply lie there and endure the slow, grinding passage of time. We have traveled a long way together. We have shivered on the dirt floor with Margaret. We have felt the scratching of the wool blanket and the bite of the flea. We have walked the stone corridors with the monk and stood watch with the soldier. We have lain in the stifling warmth of the curtained four-poster. Let us rest here, in the quiet space between their world and ours, and consider what we have witnessed. For 99% of human history, night was an absolute monarch. When the sun vanished, the world changed states. There was no technological workaround. Every single human being who lived before the electric grid shared this trauma. The mother nursing her child in 10,000 BC and the mother nursing her child in 1850 AD both stared into the same impenetrable dark, waiting for the same sun. The physical toll was immense. We are looking at a history of bodies worn down by a lifetime of sleep debt, by the stress of constant low-level cold, by the cortisol of perpetual vigilance. Their minds were shaped by the hallucination-inducing boredom of the dark hours. Yet they endured. They rose every morning, splashed cold water on their faces, and went to work. They lived, loved, fought, and built civilizations within this restrictive rhythm, accepting it as the unchangeable nature of reality. The cultural frameworks they built, the ghost stories, the prayers, the segmented sleep patterns, were not superstitions, they were adaptations. They were psychological survival strategies designed to make the unbearable bearable. The concept of the first and second sleep is perhaps the greatest testament to human flexibility. Faced with a 12-hour block of darkness that they could not shorten, our ancestors adapted their own biology. They broke the night in two, creating a hidden hour of wakefulness in the center of the void where they could think, pray, and connect. Margaret's life, ordinary, painful, and unrecorded, carried within it the DNA of the human experience. Her struggle was the struggle of the species. And now, look around you. Look at the light that floods your room with the touch of a finger. Look at the clock that tells you the second. Feel the warmth that requires no wood to be chopped. We are the first generation to banish the night. We have conquered the dark. But perhaps we have lost something in the victory. The quiet, the rhythm, and the strange, difficult intimacy of the long wait for dawn. Her exhaustion was their exhaustion. Her nights of broken sleep, of anxiety spiraling in the dark, of the desperate wait for the gray line of morning. These were not isolated incidents. They were the universal baseline of the human experience, repeated across continents and millennia, with only the slightest variations in costume and setting. Margaret is gone now. Her nights are ended. But understanding the texture of what she endured helps us grasp a fundamental truth about our past. The grand marble statue events of history, the wars, the revolutions, the signing of treaties, all played out against the backdrop of this ordinary, nightly struggle. Every historical figure you know by name lived through thousands of nights like the ones we have explored. The general who commanded armies returned to his tent to shiver in cold, inadequate sleep. The artist who painted masterpieces woke 3 times in the darkness, rubbing aching joints, uncertain of the hour. The philosopher whose logic shaped civilizations lay awake staring into the void, beset by the same physical discomforts and mental restlessness that troubled the illiterate serf. Night was the great democratizer. It was the common denominator that transcended wealth, status, and genius. Everyone waited in the dark. Everyone struggled toward rest. Everyone prayed for dawn. And then, in the blink of a historical eye, everything changed. The transformation began as a whisper: better beeswax candles, the steady burn of sperm whale oil, the hissing blue glow of gas lamps in the cities of the 19th century. But the true revolution arrived with a copper wire and a glass bulb. The arrival of electric light did not just illuminate the room, it conquered the planet's rotation. It granted us the godlike power to turn night into day, instantly, reliably, affordably. Within 3 generations, a mere heartbeat in our species' history, the fundamental human experience of night was rewritten. Darkness became a choice, not a sentence. Time became a known quantity, displayed on glowing faces in every room. Sleep was moved from a battleground of drafts and noise into warm, climate-controlled sanctuaries.
The ancient biological rhythm of segmented sleep, the first and second sleep that had guided us since the Stone Age, collapsed into a single block of continuous rest. It was forgotten so completely that when historians rediscovered it in the 20th century, it seemed like a strange fiction. We are the spoiled inheritors of this revolution. We inhabit a world where the night has been tamed. We can know the time to the nanosecond without lifting our heads from the pillow. We can dial the temperature to a precise degree. We can distract ourselves with an infinite library of entertainment, bypassing the silence and introspection that our ancestors were forced to endure. This is a privilege so staggering, so complete, that we rarely recognize it as a privilege at all. We assume that safety is the default. We assume that warmth is a human right. We assume that the night holds no monsters, only the promise of recharge. But there is value in remembering what was lost, or rather, what was escaped. The nights we have explored together were grueling. They were wet, cold, and often miserable. No rational person would trade their memory foam for Margaret's straw. Yet those nights were also deeply human. They were marked by a profound resilience, a quiet persistence of life continuing despite the odds. Our ancestors were not defeated by their nights. They found ways to make love, to tell stories, to raise children, and to build the foundations of our world, all while living half their lives in a cold shadow. Their resilience was not the heroism of novels. It was the steady, stubborn endurance of existence. So as you lie down tonight, in your bed that is soft, in your room that is warm, with the electric grid humming silently in the walls, spare a thought for the legions who came before. Think of Margaret and Thomas. Think of the anonymous peasants, the shivering soldiers on the watchtower, the monks chanting in the freezing chapel, and the nobles lonely behind their velvet curtains. They would look at your life and marvel. They would weep at the comfort you take for granted, the reliability of your rest, the certainty of your morning, the absolute defeat of the darkness. But they would also recognize you. The body that sinks into the mattress is the same body they inhabited. The mind that races with tomorrow's worries is the same mind that kept them awake. The primal hope for the light, that is a constant that no technology can erase. You are separated from them by centuries of innovation, but you are connected to them by the simple biological fact of being human, of tiring, of sleeping, and of waking. The rhythm of their nights shaped civilization for 10,000 years. The sun set, the work stopped, the darkness fell, and the struggle began. And then the pattern broke. We are the first generations to live in the optional night. We are still learning what this means. We suffer from new maladies: revenge bedtime procrastination, blue light insomnia,
the anxiety of being perpetually on. But these are the problems of abundance, not scarcity. We struggle because we have too much light, too much control, too much choice. Margaret struggled because she had none. As you drift toward sleep tonight, and you will drift because your body knows how to rest in this safety, let the weight of that history settle gently around you. All those nights, all those people, all that waiting, they made it through. The sun always came back. Your night will end too, but it will end on your terms. You will wake to a chosen alarm, not a frozen draft. You will rise in warmth. You will step into a day that is predictable and safe. This is the gift of modernity. It is the liberation from the ancient war against the elements. We are freed from the hardship of their nights, and though we may have lost the quiet intimacy of the watch, we have gained a sanctuary of rest that kings and queens could not buy.
Rest now. Sink into your controlled environment. Let sleep wash over you, continuous, unbroken, and restorative in a way that was once impossible. Let the morning find you healed. These privileges feel normal to you, but they are miracles. When you wake, perhaps carry a quiet gratitude for the difference between your night and the countless nights that paved the way. Be thankful for the darkness that stays outside, for the cold that cannot touch you, and for the sleep that arrives whole. The nights that were endured are over. The nights of rest are here. The rhythm of their struggle has ended. The darkness is conquered. You are the safe inheritor of that victory. Let yourself go now. Let the history fade into the quiet back of your mind. The darkness holds no power here. The cold is gone. The uncertainty is banished. Sleep arrives when you invite it, and dawn comes when it is due. This is your night. Rest in it. Rest deeply, and when the light returns, as it always does, rise knowing you have been given the greatest luxury in history, a night of peace. Sleep now. The journey is over. The dawn is coming. Good night, and sleep well.